Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me again today in this Part 2 micro-lecture about inclusive education in post-Soviet contexts, a comparative analysis of Kazakhstan and Russia. In the post-Soviet era, both Kazakhstan and Russia inherited an education system that was highly centralized and rooted in the Soviet defectological model, a system that categorized and segregated children with disabilities. According to inclusive education in a post-Soviet context, a case of Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan's path toward inclusion began in the 2000s, influenced by international frameworks such as UNESCO and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Yet, despite strong policies, including the 2015 to 2020 concept for inclusive education, implementation remains uneven. Challenges include limited teacher preparation, infrastructural gaps, and persistent cultural attitudes shaped by the Soviet past. In comparison, Russia initiated inclusive reforms slightly earlier, but faces similar barriers, especially the tension between formal inclusion policies and entrenched segregating practices. Both countries illustrate that inclusive education reform is not only about policy change, but also about transforming mindsets, pedagogy, and institutional cultures inherited from the Soviet system. As the 2021 book emphasizes, true inclusion in post-Soviet societies represents a shift from viewing disability through a medical lens to embracing education as a human right, a process still very much in progress. Next, let us consider cultural perceptions and societal attitudes, which are fundamental to achieving truly inclusive education. The ultimate goal, according to the World Bank Group in 2025, is to provide a single education system that supports all learners, especially marginalized and vulnerable groups. Inclusive education is strongly shaped by cultural beliefs and societal norms. Shemanov and Popova emphasize that inclusive education must incorporate a cultural perspective, understanding the specific cultural needs of learners and using cultural knowledge to integrate students with disabilities into the broader social environment. In Russia, traditional attitudes often stigmatize disability. Disability may be viewed as a family problem or source of shame rather than a shared social responsibility. Vakorina et al. In 2018 found that such beliefs influence both educators and parents, creating resistance to mainstreaming children with disabilities. As a result, most children with disabilities continue to be educated in separate settings, reinforcing the perception that they do not belong in mainstream schools. In Kazakhstan, stigma also exists, but change has been accelerating in recent years. UNICEF highlights the important role of civil society organizations, parental advocacy, and international non-governmental organizations in promoting inclusive attitudes. These initiatives help challenge stereotypes and support inclusive policies at the local level. Importantly, change in Kazakhstan is occurring both top-down and bottom-up. As Kamenopoulos argues, decolonizing inclusive education requires challenging embedded ideologies and recognizing disability as a social justice issue rather than merely a medical diagnosis. Cultural change is slow but essential. Without it, even the strongest legislation and teacher training programs cannot achieve meaningful inclusion. Understanding and addressing societal attitudes is therefore a critical step in transforming education for all learners. Now, let us examine the material conditions that support or hinder inclusive education. According to the World Bank Group, strengthening education systems is essential to ensure that all children and youth, including those from low-income households, rural and remote communities, students with disabilities, indigenous populations, and other marginalized groups, can access and participate fully in education. In Russia, the distribution of resources is uneven. Large cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg have made significant investments in accessible schools, teacher assistance, and adaptive technologies. However, rural and remote areas often lack even the basic infrastructure to accommodate students with disabilities. Zajda highlights that changes in education policy over time have focused more on urban centers, which reinforces this urban-rural divide. As a result, a child's access to inclusion often depends more on geographical location than individual need. In Kazakhstan, challenges are even more pronounced. Rural schools frequently lack accessible facilities, inclusive technologies, trained staff, and qualified teachers. Although the government's roadmap for inclusive education identifies these gaps, funding and logistical constraints continue to limit implementation. Looking internationally, Scotland provides a strong example of effective support for inclusive education. The child inclusion research into curriculum learning education resources offer evidence-based, accessible materials that empower teachers and schools to include students with diverse needs. Furthermore, in January 2024, the Scottish Government joined the Foundational Learning Compact Trust Fund to improve learning outcomes for children and young people, with a particular focus on inclusion. These examples highlight the critical role of adequate resources, infrastructure, and evidence-based support in making inclusive education a reality. Without these, legal frameworks and teacher training cannot achieve their full potential. Finally, let us assess the current state of inclusive education in Russia and Kazakhstan. In Russia, the first inclusive school was established in Moscow in 1991. However, progress over the next 2 decades was slow. In 2010, the National Educational Initiative, Our New School, approved by then-President Dmitry Medvedev, introduced the principle of a school for all. This initiative emphasized that every school should ensure the successful socialization of children with disabilities. In Kazakhstan, significant investments are being made to create comfortable, accessible schools for children with disabilities. On the slide, you can see 2 visual representations of the data. The left chart shows an 11.4% increase in reported child disability in Kazakhstan from 2021 to 2023, indexed to 2021 equals 100. The right pie diagram illustrates that 68.4% of children with disabilities are aged 7 to 18, highlighting the urgent need for age-appropriate inclusive education environments. These figures demonstrate that inclusive education is not only a policy priority, but also requires constant investment in infrastructure, technologies, trained teachers, and continuous professional development. Overall, while both Russia and Kazakhstan have made important strides toward inclusive education, systemic challenges remain. Addressing these requires sustained policy implementation, resource allocation, cultural change, and teacher capacity building to ensure that all students have equitable opportunities to learn and thrive. In conclusion, Kazakhstan and Russia provide a compelling comparative case study in the development of inclusive education in the post-Soviet era. Both countries face deep-rooted challenges, many of which stem from the shared legacy of Soviet segregation and treatment of students with disabilities. However, their paths toward inclusion differ. In Russia, creating a truly inclusive education system requires a shift in mindset and educational culture, moving from exclusive to inclusive practices. While Russia has a strong legal framework, it continues to struggle with regional disparities and persistent cultural stigma. In Kazakhstan, inclusive reforms have been embraced with energy and international cooperation, but significant gaps remain in resources, infrastructure, and teacher preparedness. For both countries, essential steps to transform policy into practice include modernizing teacher training with inclusive pedagogy, sustained investment in infrastructure and accessible technologies, promoting social change that views diversity as a strength, moving away from a medicalized view of disability, recognizing that inclusion is a right, not charity. As educators, policymakers, and advocates, our responsibility is clear: to ensure that all children, regardless of ability, background, or geography, are fully supported to learn and thrive. Thank you for your attention. For further reading, please refer to the references listed on the last slide. See you next week.